William Henry Fox Talbot, was born in 1800 into a prosperous English family with an estate at LaRoche Abbey in Wiltshire. He studied mathematics and classics at Cambridge, graduating in 1821, and spent his early career as a member of Parliament while pursuing scientific work on the side. His entry into photography began in 1833 at Lake Como in Italy, where, frustrated by his inability to sketch landscapes accurately by hand using a camera lucida, he began thinking about whether light itself could be made to trace and fix an image chemically onto paper. By 1835, Talbot had produced what he called photogenic drawings, paper coated with silver chloride that darkened when exposed to light. He made contact prints of leaves and lace and exposed paper inside small cameras. His earliest surviving camera photograph, a tiny image of a latticed window at LaRoche Abbey, dates to August 1835. He then set this work aside for roughly 3 years, making no public announcement. That silence ended in January 1839 when news arrived from France that Louis Daguerre had announced a photographic process. Talbot rushed to exhibit his photogenic drawings at the Royal Institution on January 25th of that year, days after the French announcement, to establish that he had independent prior work. The demonstration drew attention but also highlighted that Talbot had held his discovery privately rather than sharing it. The process Daguerre had developed produced images of striking clarity on silver-coated copper plates, each one a unique object with no negative and no capacity for reproduction. The French government struck a deal. It paid Daguerre and the heirs of Nicephore Niepce, who had worked on photographic experiments in the 1820s, a combined annual pension of 10,000 francs. In exchange, the daguerreotype was released freely to the public on August 19, 1839, available for anyone to practice without licensing or fees. The French government framed this explicitly as a gift to the world. There was one exception. Daguerre had quietly registered a separate British patent 5 days before the French announcement. So British practitioners of the daguerreotype were not covered by the gift and had to pay him. Talbot, meanwhile, continued developing his own process. In 1841, he patented what he renamed the calotype, from the Greek for beautiful impression. The calotype used paper coated with silver iodide, then brushed immediately before use with a solution of silver nitrate and gallic acid. Exposed in a camera for a period ranging from roughly 30 seconds to a few minutes depending on light conditions, it produced a latent image not visible to the eye, which was then chemically developed to bring out a paper negative. That negative, when contact printed onto a second sheet of sensitized paper, produced a positive image. The fundamental architecture of this system, a negative producing multiple positives, became the basis of all mainstream chemical photography for the following 150 years. British patent number 8842 was filed on February 8, 1841. Talbot followed it with a second patent in 1843, covering further refinements, including the use of gallic acid to accelerate development, and he held rights to the earlier photogenic drawing process as well. Together, these gave him broad legal control over paper-based photography in Britain. He did not hold back from using it. The licensing structure Talbot put in place was stratified. Amateur photographers who practiced the calotype privately were in principle treated differently from those earning money from it. In practice, the boundary was contested and the fees for commercial use were steep enough to discourage entry into the market. Talbot sent correspondence to photographers across England asserting his rights and requiring them to take out formal licenses. Some complied. Others attempted to practice in ways that avoided the letter of his claims, using slight variations in chemistry or materials. Talbot pursued those he believed were infringing regardless. Photographers wishing to practice the calotype in England and Wales were required to obtain a license from Talbot and pay fees. The terms distinguished between amateur practice and commercial use. Portraits taken for payment required a separate commercial license with higher fees. Antoine Claudet, a French-born photographer operating in London who had purchased a daguerreotype license from Daguerre, negotiated with Talbot for additional rights to work with paper-based processes and paid substantial annual sums to operate legally. Henry Collen, a miniature painter who became one of the first to offer calotype portraits commercially in Britain, worked under direct agreement with Talbot and faced ongoing constraints on how and where he could practice. Scotland operated differently. Talbot's patents did not extend to Scotland under the legal arrangements of the time, and Scottish photographers could practice the calotype freely. The consequences were visible. David Octavius Hill, a painter, and Robert Adamson, a chemist, began collaborating in Edinburgh in 1843, and over the next 4 years produced more than 1,500 calotype negatives, covering portraits of ministers, fishermen, working people, and landscapes along the Firth of Forth. Adamson died in January 1848 at age 26, ending the partnership, but what they produced in 4 years of unobstructed work is considered among the most accomplished bodies of early photography anywhere in the world. The comparison with England, where fees and licenses slowed uptake, was noted by contemporaries. The direct clash between Talbot and the photographic community came to a head in 1851 when Frederick Scott Archer published the details of the collodion wet plate process in the journal The Chemist. Archer was a sculptor and self-taught photographer who had been searching for a way to achieve the sharpness of the daguerreotype combined with the reproducibility of the calotype. He coated glass plates with collodion, a solution of nitrocellulose dissolved in ether and alcohol, sensitized the coated plates with silver nitrate, exposed them in a camera while still wet, and developed them immediately before the collodion dried. The results were sharp negatives on glass, finer grained than paper calotypes and capable of producing multiple prints from a single negative. Crucially, Archer published the process without taking out a patent, making it available to anyone with the materials and the training to use it. Talbot's response was to claim that the collodion wet plate process fell within the scope of his existing patents. His argument rested on the position that his 1841 patent covered the general principle of sensitizing a surface with silver compounds, exposing it to light and developing a latent image, regardless of what material the surface was made from. He wrote to photographers using the collodion process, asserting that they owed him licensing fees, and he backed this up with legal action. The pivotal case was Talbot versus LaRoche, heard in December 1854 in the Court of Common Pleas in London. Martin LaRoche was a photographer who had used the wet plate process to make portrait photographs for paying clients. Talbot sued him for patent infringement under the 1841 and 1843 patents. The case turned on whether Talbot's 1841 patent, written to describe a process using paper, could reasonably be interpreted to cover a process using glass that Talbot had neither described nor anticipated when filing. Talbot's legal team argued that the underlying chemical principles were the same. The defense argued that Archer's process was a distinct invention that used different materials and produced different results. Baron Alderson, presiding, directed the jury that a patent must be construed in terms of what its inventor had actually described, not extended to cover subsequent inventions by others that happened to share some chemical steps. The jury deliberated and found for LaRoche. Talbot lost. The journal The Photographic Society, which had been founded in London in 1853 partly as an institutional counter to Talbot's licensing claims, published a response to the verdict describing it as a decisive clearing of the ground for the practice of photography in Britain. The Society had been actively collecting testimony and coordinating responses to Talbot's legal threats for the 2 years prior to the trial. Individual photographers had corresponded with each other about how to resist or work around his claims. Several had exchanged letters about the specific chemistry of the wet plate process and whether it could be shown to differ sufficiently from Talbot's patent language to withstand a legal challenge. The Talbot versus LaRoche verdict removed the main legal threat, and adoption of the wet plate process accelerated sharply through 1855 and into the following years. Archer died in May 1857 at 34 years old in financial difficulty, leaving a wife and children with no income. He had received nothing from the widespread commercial use of the collodion process because he had chosen not to patent it. After his death, a public subscription was raised for his family. Contributions came from photographers across Britain who had built businesses using his freely given process. The fund collected a few £100s, which stood in contrast to the commercial scale of the industry his invention had enabled. The numbers available from the period make the effects of Talbot's patent regime reasonably clear. France, where the daguerreotype was free to practice and no equivalent to the calotype patent existed to restrict paper photography, had an estimated 2,000 daguerreotype studios by 1851. French photographers also worked with paper-based and later glass-based processes in parallel, without licensing obligations. The United States, entirely outside Talbot's reach, had developed a photographic industry of comparable scale. By 1853, an estimated 10,000 practitioners were working there, with close to 100 studios in New York City alone by the late 1840s. Britain, operating under licensing constraints for paper photography and under Daguerre's separate British patent for the daguerreotype, developed more slowly through the same period. Visitors to the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace in London noted that French and American photographic work on display was commercially more advanced and technically more developed than the British entries. The exhibition's jury comments on photography were recorded, and they identified Britain as lagging behind its competitors in commercial output and variety of application. Talbot's 1841 patent expired in 1855 under the standard 14-year term of British patent law at the time. By then, the practical question was moot. The daguerreotype declined sharply through the mid-1850s. The calotype essentially disappeared from commercial practice, and wet plate collodion became the dominant process in studios across Britain and everywhere else. The legal clear air that followed the Talbot versus LaRoche verdict and the patent expiry allowed the British photographic industry to catch up, and it did so rapidly through the second half of the decade. Talbot himself was not a person whose career reduced to these legal disputes. He was a genuine working scientist with a broad range of contributions. He read Assyrian cuneiform and published translations of inscribed tablets from Nineveh, contributing to a collective scholarly effort to verify competing translations among British, French, and German scholars. He made early experiments in photomicroscopy, attaching cameras to microscopes to photograph specimens too small to see clearly with the naked eye. He worked on photogravure, a method of etching photographic images into metal plates for printing reproduction, and patented this in 1852. He corresponded extensively with scientists across Europe on topics from number theory to optics. He died in 1877 at 76. What sits in the record alongside those contributions is the 14-year period during which the process he invented and patented was practiced under licensing restrictions that demonstrably slowed its adoption in Britain relative to France, Scotland, and the United States. The calotype negative to positive system was the structural foundation of subsequent photography. Talbot was its inventor. He was also the person who charged fees to use it, sued to extend its reach to processes he had not invented, lost in court, and watched the technology move past him. All of these things are in the same record. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe.